Terminating transactions is generally not where we want to be when we either write an offer or accept an offer. But sometimes it's reasonable and sometimes it's necessary. Some of the questions that may arise are: when is it feasible? When is it reasonable? And what are the risks associated with a termination? So let's explore some of the basics of terminating a real estate transaction. Sellers generally have a rather limited set of circumstances in which they're able to terminate a transaction. Once a seller decides to sell and they're in contract, they're essentially bound to the contract. This means that in general, a seller cannot terminate based on a change of heart, say, or personal circumstance. In most cases, the seller's only opportunity to terminate a transaction is when a buyer is in breach of contract and fails to cure that breach, an industry standard which the Carta's purchase and sale agreement also follows. Buyers have many more opportunities to terminate than sellers do in a given transaction, and that only makes sense. Buyers take on much more risk when entering a transaction, and that's partly why there's a due diligence process by default in most transactions. The most common points for termination for buyers happen during the due diligence process. These are issues with the title, inspection reports, property disclosures, or failures to get financing. Buyers can generally also safely terminate if a seller is in breach of contract. Note, however, that any terminations must be done correctly in order to protect the buyer from any further risk, as we'll go over in the next section. So what are the risks that buyers and sellers face when deciding whether or not to terminate? For buyers, the primary risk is whether or not they lose their earnest money. A buyer can generally terminate a transaction without risk of losing their earnest money if they terminate due to a failed contingency, for example, financing, or a bad inspection, or due to a seller's breach in contract. Terminations for buyers can happen outside of these circumstances, but they may be at a higher risk of losing their earnest money. For sellers terminating a transaction, the risks are much more circumstantial. Perhaps the seller needs to relist the property, or maybe they have a backup offer, but the terms are different than they were for the transaction which was just terminated. In any case, the seller must be very certain that the terms of the termination are reasonable, as they face a higher degree of risk when it comes to liability for litigation. One thing to always consider is that terminations are final, which means that once you've committed, there's no turning back. Even though Carta lets you complete and submit the termination on your own, it's always advisable to seek good legal counsel before making a decision. Knowing how, when, and why to terminate is a necessary part of the real estate process. By having knowledge on the appropriate ways of terminating as either a seller or a buyer, you'll be in a much better position to navigate your real estate journey. At Carta, we do our best to empower you on your real estate journey. So make sure you watch all of our learning materials to empower you on your do-it-yourself real estate journey. Thanks for watching.